Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Nice that you are joining this interview. I'm sitting here today with Professor Henrik von Wehrden of the Leuphana University in Lüneburg, Germany. And I did my bachelor's here, and there we met. And Henrik holds a professorship for quantitative methods in sustainability science. And also, Henrik shares, let's say, Buddhist beliefs and has a, let's say, intense story. Got struck by lightning. Since then, doesn't feel anger or hate anymore. At least you like to say you don't know if it comes back, but
sometimes I wonder whether there are like slight subtle chances of this returning, but not so much. I mean, I came to the conclusion what remains of me is what I give to other people. If I give hate, I think hate remains. And for me, this is an emotional thing. This is not a conscious choice that I made or a rational decision that I took. It's just, I guess this is how my mind works now. And then I started reading around, and then the closest approximation to, I guess, how I see myself is Buddhism. Mm-hmm. So I still think it's pretty diverse. It's a construct, it changed over time. But in order to take a shortcut and to be in this whole kind of like societal locating yourself, I guess it's easier to explain it to people than to get the whole backstory, which I guess is different for everyone. So that's why I sometimes say Buddhism. But yeah, people use all sorts of labels.
Mm-hmm. So I was also asking on Instagram and in the YouTube channel community if people have questions to you. And one question that was there is if there's some kind of scientific explanation or neuroscientific things you have looked at about this phenomenon that you experienced.
I guess it's rare. Like Western science hasn't started to deeply explore this as of yet. Of course, in the East, it's been known a long time. I mean, like psychonauts, as people now sometimes call them. Like psychonauts, I quite like that word. I think I have it from Bob Thurman. And it's been around a long time before Buddhism. I mean, that people explore their inner worlds. I think that's pretty big. It's just been always around. In Western medicine, there are now some studies. There are some neurologists who try to understand the phenomena. And I mean, the effects, for instance, that meditation can have on people's brains are profound. So there are studies that clearly show if people regularly meditate a bit, not even a lot, for a few weeks, you see changes in the brain, where you see human mind, brain very complex. So we're just scratching the surface. We don't really understand what is happening there. Studies about people who lost part of their brains, who got into an accident and so on, show this is very fluid environment. It seems as if it's related to our primal fear center, that people sometimes have intuitive reactions to things, and that it tinkers with that. And then there are some studies that show that people can even change their physiology and all sorts of things. Western medicine has different approaches, still slicing up people a lot. So, and that's why it's starting. I think it's making us hopeful. And there's also more studies, not only in medicine, but in psychology and all sorts of other fields where people try to gain a deeper understanding about people's happiness. Like what makes people happy, what makes them maybe a little bit more resilient, a little bit more stable.
Mm-hmm. And now talking about science, you have a kind of different approach to science than maybe mainstream, very radical, going to the root, and also trying to combine ethics with empiricism. And I'm wondering, probably you have made these choices and this approach in contrast to what is happening in mainstream science. Do you have some critical points you would like to share about mainstream science?
Well, science, I love science. Let's begin with that. I really love science. I'm a scientist. But I mean, science was never meant to be static. But if something becomes really big, and I mean, luckily we live in a society where science is pretty big, we have a lot of scientific knowledge, but if things become bigger and bigger, they tend to become less adaptable, a little bit less fluid, more static. And I think this is where we are a bit stuck. And people are really worried about the end of the Enlightenment, I think, because like the Enlightenment with all the other problems it generated, one of the points it made is it put science into boxes. I mean, when you look at the ancient Greeks, when you go to India, when you go into other cultures, it was often a different approach. And then with deeper knowledge, well, naturally, not everyone could know everything. So we went deeper into these rabbit holes. But now we really see that the pressing issues that we have that tend to really challenge our very existence on the planet, they need to be connected. We need to have a little bit more of a like holistic view, what people nowadays say. And I think that's quite nice. I'm happy that we come to this conclusion, and then more and more people are evolving. Whether I'm then that radical, I mean, I often say I'm like post-disciplinary, just because like, these constructs, yeah, maybe some people think they were helpful for some time, might be, but I think for me, never happened, because just from the very beginning, I always thought the harm that we have by putting our identities into boxes is bigger than, trying to connect, trying to be there with others, and not defining myself as being different from others. I think that's where I got stuck pretty early on. And I guess that propelled me a little bit in this direction. But in the end, it was serendipity. I mean, I could have studied economics in my hometown, and then I would have been stuck there. So I'm happy how it evolved now. Who knows what different plans would have been there.
So talking about your surrounding, you are surrounded by lots of young people, students, and I would wonder what are maybe some observations you make on our generation.
It's always just single data points. I think the current generation is very motivated. I think is very competent. Like when I compare the level of how people work, I think is much higher than my generation. Like what people can achieve already as first semester students, it's great. But then it's a way and not a goal. And I think this is one of the challenges, that the system compartmentalized everything into achievable goals. And that's a bit of a bad hand that your generation, I once heard, was dealt. So I think this is one of the challenges. Well, and the other challenge is there's just too much information. There's just so many opportunities. And I think we passed the point where for many people this is more like a burden. I mean, people have the freedom to choose. Great. I think this is the most important point. But I know from my own observation, and I mean, there are these classic psychological studies and all this, it's just, if it becomes so overwhelming, then it's not always helpful. And I think this is a challenge that I see, that people have all these opportunities. There's all these initiatives that are great. There's like people working on all sorts of things, people having like YouTube channels, like all that. But I mean, the day is 24 hours, and sometimes we have to stop, and sometimes we have to call it a day. And like I feel this is really a challenge. And of course, this has been accelerated by us, because it was probably us and our generation that came up with the narrative, for instance, that we have to act now, that we have this kind of urgency. And I think urgency is a great narrative. And I think it's also important that we act now. But if we constantly measure ourselves as individuals against this urgency, then it can be challenging for many. And I think this is where I have great sympathy, where I often feel with your generation, there are some challenges. And I think they're different from the challenges that my generation partly faced.
Mm-hmm. Another question that was asked is if you would say you are an optimist or a pessimist, and how that has changed over the course of your life.
Yeah. I'm notorious among the students for being a radical optimist, as I always say it. And it's often a source of great misunderstanding, because people think I ignore certain realities. And I think it's untrue, because we have the same information. Like, the information is the information age, like, became available to everyone. So we can all choose, we can all say, I check out this information, I check out that information. And then people often tell me, yeah, I'm not really an optimist, like, so much bad is happening. It's true, many things are bad. First question is, can I change them? If I cannot change them, should I burden myself with them? And then my personal choice, I think not. I think there's many people who have less possibilities, bad lives. But if I cannot influence that directly, and if I even cannot spread that far indirectly, should I beat myself up about it every day? I think it's another burden. I think it's a challenge. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we look at the same information. Facts is what gives us a reason to act. If people decide that they say they are realist, I'm always baffled, because we have the same facts. So how can we define that we say, okay, like, I see it different than you and I'm less optimistic, because we have the same information? And then I think it's a choice. Then I think it's a choice that we could dare, that we say, okay, this is what's happening. And now I choose that I think in the long run is going to be better. I think it's going to be good. And I'm really happy about that. I have a long-term perspective. And I think that's related because my own existence is, like, in the whole thing, very negligible. So I sometimes have the feeling the reason that I can declare something to be, may it be optimistic or pessimistic, is also slightly, a little bit focused on the ego, is sometimes a bit too strong. Maybe we should take a step back and should look at the whole picture. And the planet has evolved. We also have evolved. Like, I see this chance for optimism, and I hope it can change people's minds for the better, so that people can get into action, that they can change things, that they can try to move things into a better direction, because we have to do that now. That's really important. And I think that was never different. There was always suffering in the world, and it will go on for a long time. I think this will not end tomorrow. We should be at least then realistic about it, but I see long-term perspective. And there I think it's great. I think it can be wonderful. I'm really very naive to this end, I think.
And you've always been like that, so to say.
I think it never really changed, no. I mean, it changed profoundly a few years ago when I felt a stronger connection to other people, other beings, but I guess I was always more or less an optimist. I should ask old friends. Let's see, maybe I should consult them.